Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Prime and Load. Today, we're going to be continuing with our Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 series. We're here with our expert, Dr. Arran Johnston, and we still don't have Alex, but like I said in the first episode, we're meeting our PhD quota, so we're still good. So, Arran, you have done a huge amount with the Jacobite rebellions and researching and writing, but this episode, we're really going to be getting to your area of focus with the Battle of Prestonpans. But before we jump into that, we left off with the raising of the Stuart Standard. Can you give us a quick recap on what has happened up until this point?
Sure. So we've picked up with the beginning of the final chapter of the Jacobite story, as it were. This is a long-running conflict over the dynastic succession in Britain, and the latest iteration of the Royal House of Stuart's main male line, young Charles Edward Stuart, 24 years old, grown up to believe that he is going to be the guy who restores his family to the British thrones. Having come up to France and hoped to be a part of a French-led invasion, has instead had to go it alone. So he's taken an enormous gamble, really, of sailing to Scotland with very few men. Very little by way of resources, and sort of thrown himself, as he himself put it, on the mercy of his own people. And so on the 19th of August 1745, Charles Edward had summoned the clans of Western and Central Scotland to respond to his call, to assemble with him, create an army that he himself will lead despite having no military experience, and that he's hoping to ride the crest of a popular wave that will carry him to the Scottish capital and then on to London. So that process has been a long time in the coming. Nobody was expecting it to come, though, when it suddenly broke in the summer of 1745.
Awesome. Thank you. And that was a very, very quick overview. I would suggest if you have not listened to part one, I would say pause here, go back, listen to part one, because it provides an enormous amount of context and detail for what we will be setting up and talking about in this episode. So, Arran, can we talk about kind of the forces that have responded to the raising of the standard? We touched on it a little bit, but Charles Edward, he raises standards and he gets, I think you said, close to 1,000 men, and he starts to put them into an army. Can you kind of describe that army to us? Who are the key players who actually shows up?
Yeah, so at the beginning, this is a clan army. No way of putting it other than that. It's assembled by the chieftains of the clans in the immediate vicinity of the area where Charles is. That means it's quite unique in the European context. Therefore, it's not been raised on a regular regimental basis. It has been raised by chieftains who have called out their tenants and dependents. They expect to be led in the field by a chieftain or his family and designated leaders, and so we have an interesting social dynamic in each clan. They expect to be led from the front. They're largely coming sort of self-armed. Many of them, the Highland gentlemen with their broadswords and their very expensive broadswords, and their targes and their pistols, their muskets. But obviously, as you go down the social ladder through the ranks of those clan units, the arms get poorer as you move back through. Some clans are able to mobilize hundreds of men. Some clans and septs are mobilizing dozens of men. And of course, they all expect for their chief to be their colonel and his family to provide the officer class and so on. So Charles Edward has a problem that dogs him throughout the war, really, in that he wants to create a modern army that's capable of going toe-to-toe with the British army, in largely comprising, certainly in the first half of the war, of Highland clansmen who want to fight with kith and kin, and groups that are based on those important social structures. So you can have there is a process in which smaller units are brigaded together with larger ones to create a relative attempt at consistency for units for command and control purposes. But again, the clan system means that some clans will fight with other clans, but not with ones that they don't have pre-existing traditions and relationships with, and so on. So that's not an easy environment in which to try and forge an army, especially when you don't have a staff, essentially. Charles Edwards leans very heavily throughout the conflict on a man called John Sullivan, who's served in French campaigns previously. He's an Irishman. And Sullivan, he rests on us essentially is what we would consider a chief of staff. There's others that have got some military experience in there as well. People like MacDonald of Kleppock, who's served in French armies before. But in terms of military experience that's immediately available to Charles Edward, most of it is from Jacobites who've served previously in Jacobite armies. And as we touched on last time, most of those campaigns have not been especially successful. So there's not a lot of of promising potential that you might see in terms of forging a modern army here. But that's what he's got to do, and that's what he does. And what he tries to do very quickly is to focus it on action in order to bind it together and to keep moving and allow the process of the army growing and evolving and growing its structure and its capacity on the move, and it's through moving towards its objectives that Charles Edward hopes to develop it. There is, I think, still a hope in Charles Edward's mind that there won't be an awful lot of fighting that is necessary if, as he hopes, he is, in context, he believes that he's coming to a people who are suffering under an unpopular government, under heavy taxation, and are likely to welcome the operation to be liberated from that. So maybe at the start of the war, it's more about movement and confidence and securing space, and then as things move forwards, the concerns about how to actually form this into a fighting army can be addressed in turn.
Awesome. And we talked about it a little bit before. You work at the Prestonpans Museum. I'm curious, what are some of the misconceptions that you run into about this Jacobite army, and how do you? I mean, what's the truth, right? I'm sure you get a whole lot. You said it again. This is a really romanticized conflict.
Well, the biggest misconception, perhaps, is that the situation I've just described remains the same through the rest of the war. It doesn't. As the Jacobite army progresses, as it starts to achieve some of its objective and move into different parts of the country, it is able to evolve. It's able to draw men from different backgrounds, from different parts of the country. Its purely Highland Gallic character dilutes considerably, although the army deliberately inflates that because there is this perception or belief that it's Highlanders that will strike fear into the enemy. So you want to, regardless of whether your men are coming from the northeast of Scotland or the southwest, you want to make them look like and sound like and behave like Highlanders. So that situation I described is not the Jacobite army that you get towards the end of the war, which is more structured, more experienced, and more recognisable as an army rather than a clan gathering. So that's really important, and the test of it is its military ability as the campaigns go on.
Hey everyone, Lee here for the Prime and Load team. We're passionate about exploring 18th century history and tactics and bringing those stories to you. But we need your help to grow our ranks. Please share this episode with a fellow history buff, leave a review where you can, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Most of all, join our email list. It gets you updates and insights into what's coming. You can join by using the link in this episode's description below. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the episode. So we have Charles Edward. He's raised an army, but I'm guessing that does not go unnoticed. How does the government in London or in England respond to this?
So there's several weeks between Charles Edward landing and the standard being raised. And as you say, it does not go unnoticed that he's here. Not least because there are some of the people that he contacts that he hopes will rise, who immediately inform the government that he's here. And the initial rumours that spread assume that he must have landed with French troops, because why on earth would he not? And so there is a sort of a sense of an initial sort of panic at the first intelligence that is here. Then there's a sort of calming down as it becomes clear that he's actually that there is no French presence with him, and so the sense becomes that, okay, this is concerning, but it was also rash, and it can probably be contained. And so clearly the initial policy is containment. The Georgian government is fortunate in having a very active agent in Duncan Forbes of Culloden, the Lord President of the courts. And as a Highlander himself, he's extremely well connected. He's extremely invested in the development and evolution of Highland society. And so he knows who's who. He hears every rumour, and he does a lot of work behind the scenes to try and keep the waverers away from the Jacobite standard. But it is a challenge that needs to be addressed. And so the Secretary of State for Scotland, who's the Marquess of Tweeddale, authorises and directs the military commander in North Britain, Lieutenant General Sir John Cope, to take what field force he can assemble and to move it into the Highlands in order to disperse the Jacobite threat before it's able to develop and snowball. And in this task, they should be relatively well aided by the fact that the government has, since the previous Jacobite risings, invested large amounts of money in new roads and barracks and fortifications around Scotland, precisely so that any future Jacobite stirrings can be contained and prevented from snowballing into the threat that 1715 had become. So containment is the initial policy. Problem is that really, in order to contain the threat, you need to have a sufficient military force to do so, and the reality is that the British Army does not have an overwhelming military presence in Scotland. Obviously, we're aware of the international context and the fact that the British Army is so heavily engaged on the continent, including a large number of Scottish troops, of course. So the British sort of home garrison, if you like, in Scotland is spread very thin. We're talking 3,000 or 4,000 at most in Scotland when this conflict breaks out. So that's not a lot, and Charles Edwards is already eking out a fair chunk of that superiority. Once you then take out all of those that you need for garrison duty to hold the existing forts and arsenals, the available field force that General Cope is able to put together isn't particularly impressive in terms of numbers. He actually gathers his most of his field strength at Stirling on the same day that the standard is raised at Glenfinnan. So the time lag is actually it's quite impressive how well informed the government were able to be at this stage. But the decision is that the Highlands will be unsuitable ground for cavalry. So the 2 regiments of dragoons that General Cope has available to him are left to patrol and protect the lowlands, whilst the infantry force moves up into the Highlands. So that gives Johnny Cope less than 2,000 men that he's moving north with. He's got a very small train of artillery, six guns. He picks up some mortars en route as well. Eventually has a train of 6 mortars, but with no Royal Artillery crews to man them. And so an improvised artillery train. But there is still a sense that this is an untrained Highland banditti that should be able to be dispersed by show of force by the professionals before it's able to develop into anything more significant. So it's considered to be enough. There's also a policy that arming the loyal clans in the north will augment General Cope's forces when he goes forward. Now, this was not an uncontroversial policy because there was a lot of reluctance to start distributing arms amongst Highlanders when their loyalties might be uncertain. But Cope was certainly and clearly hoping that he would encounter plenty of people once he got into the Highlands who he could arm and equip. And so he went north with commissions, with spare arms in order to augment his own strength, and to go back to the old policies of allowing the Highlands to be responsible for policing itself as much as possible. So that's the plan. General Cope heads off to the north. He uses the military roads and heads towards the Highlands to nip the rebellion in the bud. As I alluded to, the Jacobites themselves, Charles Edward also has a strategy of getting his army on the move as quickly as possible. So after a few days of consolidation at Glenfinnan, he gets them moving. He bypasses the garrison at Fort William, which should have been much more problematic to him than it was. But as is the case, a garrison and a fort is only as strong as its garrison, and it's the investment just hadn't been there in the manpower. So he bypasses that, moves up towards the mountains, and there's this extraordinary sort of failure to confront each other at what's called the Corryarrick Pass near Fort Augustus. It's a difficult road. It's one of the military roads that zigzags back and forth up the side of the mountains onto the high plateau beyond. And General Cope gets to the bottom of that, has a good look at it, and decides that it would be very, very risky to move his small army up into that pass when he's getting intelligence to suggest the Jacobites might already be at the summit. And so the Jacobites, meanwhile, are at the opposite end, desperately rushing to try and get up into that position ahead of him. They're not quite there, so General Cope might have been able to push his luck a little bit and get up and onto the plateau first. But he doesn't. He plays a conservative hand here. He gets the express consent of his subordinate officers to the decision not to go into the pass at the Corryarrick, and so withdraws to Dalwhinnie. So that's the first moment where you have a sense that actually the government's plan is unraveling. If it's already backing down and retracing its own footsteps, then containment isn't working. They then hope that by moving towards Inverness, they will get into area where they are able to arm more loyal clans, and the expectation is that the Jacobite army will take the bait and will follow them, and that they will be at least able to keep the war in the Highlands. And that's indeed what most Jacobite clan chiefs seem keen to do. If you see the enemy not in great numerical strength, lacking in cavalry, and moving away from you, then you think, well, now we have an advantage. The Jacobite army is growing little by little, and so it's close to reaching numerical parity with General Cope's infantry already. And so there is a sense that if we're going to fight and win against a professional army, the best place to do it is in the areas we know, here in the Highlands, in our own territory. But Charles Edward sort of wins his first sort of assertion test, if you like, here in the Corryarrick, because he persuades them that the objective is not to fight battles in the Highlands. The objective is to secure the capital and to create the context for a restoration of the Stuarts, and so he will not be bound to the idea of fighting a Highland war. So as General Cope is turning north, the Jacobites turn south, and the two armies diverge, and that really is the moment where it turns from being something that was seen as containable, as small scale, and as a distraction, to actually being a potentially very, very serious threat as the Jacobites start moving down towards the lowlands and towards places like Perth, which were important towns. So that opening phase of the campaign, within those first couple of weeks after the rising of the Standard, already it looks like Charles Edward is capable of moving his army in unexpected ways and of controlling the narrative, of controlling where the initiative in the war lies.
Awesome. And you've already said that the British do not want to take cavalry into the Highlands. These passes are and terrain are kind of dictating how commanders move. Can you kind of briefly describe the terrain in these areas? Because clearly it seems like it's having a massive impact on the events that are unfolding.
Many of your listeners might know Scotland is roughly divided into highlands and lowlands in a sort of diagonal line that runs through the middle of the country. There's still a lot of contention over exactly where the boundaries lie. There's a much more grey area in between. But essentially, the northwest of Scotland is very rugged, very mountainous, deep glens. and the glens themselves and the lochs sort of funnel you in certain directions, essentially. So unless you're a Highland army with exceptional motivations, for example, like the Marquis of Montrose back 100 years previously in the 1640s, where you can take a gamble of taking a Highland, lightly armed, very hardy Highland force over the tops of the mountains to surprise your enemy, you are largely bound to the movements of the lays of the glens and the roads. The government has invested a huge amount in road building exercises done by the British Army in Scotland in the wake of the rising of 1715-19, and that was to facilitate the British Army being able to move into the Highlands in a way that it had found more difficult previously. Of course, the flip side of that is that it also allows Highland armies to move out of the Highlands with the same facility. So this was, it still is, extremely challenging terrain. Anyone who's gone up into the Western Highlands will be familiar with that. It means, though, that the routes are pretty well established. It means that you do know where the obvious bottlenecks are. So in that sense, it's familiar territory because those routes are so clear, and there are often very few options that you have. The string of forts, particularly Fort Augustus in the centre of the Great Glen, Fort William down at the southwest end, and Fort George up at Inverness, they were designed to control that movement across the Highlands, but undermanned, under-resourced garrisons that were not on a war footing, were caught out on the hop, and the Jacobite army simply goes around them. So as you then move down from the Highlands down into Perthshire towards Blair Athol and then on towards Perth itself, the landscape becomes softer, more fertile, and more heavily populated. And then so that's that. So as you move into the lowlands around Perth, and then of course the key strategic position is Stirling on the River Forth, because on the bridge there and the fords around Stirling, you are able to cross the River Forth, the key artery that feeds into central Scotland. So if you want to control Scotland, you have to come out of the Highlands. You have to get through the bottlenecks of the passes in the Highlands. Then you have to get through the bottleneck around Stirling. And the capital, Edinburgh, which is on the southeastern side of the country, is quite a long way from you as a Highlander. So there are a succession of challenges the Jacobite army has to face geographically to get control of the capital. Not least when, once they move into open territory, there are 2 regiments of dragoons which are able to operate in that territory probably and hopefully more comfortably, General Cope would hope. There's also a big fortress at Stirling Castle, of course, and another at Edinburgh Castle, the key arsenals for Scotland. And Stirling should be able to block any realistic advances further. So all these routes are pretty well established to any student of Scottish history, because armies all have to move in the same through the same passes, through the same roadways, and through the same bottlenecks. The problem that General Cope suddenly finds himself facing in late August, early September, is that he's just at the wrong end of the country. He's moving north when the Jacobites are moving south. They haven't taken the bait. And now the Jacobites are much closer to all of those objectives and the economically more important lowland areas than he is. And so that's his first mistake. I suppose it's fair that we should touch on General Cope himself. He's a very experienced soldier. He's a career soldier, been in the army all of his life, served in the wars of the Spanish Succession, and obviously, and he was at Dettingen, after which he was made Lieutenant General. So he's a very experienced soldier. He's used to commanding considerable bodies of men, but what he hasn't done is completely independently command a field force on his own. So this is in a sense new territory for him, but he was considered a safe pair of hands, and if not expected to be any sort of military genius, he was at least considered competent and capable. The fact that he is complaining right from the commencement of the war that he hasn't got the resources he needs was something that the government was less keen to draw attention to afterwards.
If I could just backtrack slightly as well, as you were speaking there, Aaron, it struck me, you talked about the deliberate attempt to cultivate a Highland aura around the Jacobite army, even when it ceased to be an entirely Highland army. But I mean, almost the Highlands themselves are part of the bogeyman folk memories as far as the British regular army is concerned. I mean, they go and stick their heads in these Highland passes in some of the earlier campaigns. I'm thinking Killiecrankie here particularly, and their heads get a good kicking. It's on the one hand, it's a fairly ballsy thing for Cope to do in the first place to go into the Highlands looking for a fight, and at the same time, you can quite understand why actually forcing Coriaric against a potential entrenched enemy or enemy ready to come sweeping down the slopes, broadsword in hand, wouldn't really appeal, and certainly I would have thought would have not done the morale of his troops a great deal of good as they're marching into what must have literally felt like hostile territory, almost that the hills themselves are part of the enemy, never mind the people who come out of them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. And of course, Cope is exposed to political pressure here. He's getting directives from the Secretary of State, who is in London and operating on intelligence that's somewhat lagging behind what Cope can see on the ground. And he's being told, push up, contain it, nip it in the bud, deal with it quickly. We've got bigger things to worry about. And at the same time, he's writing back saying, I haven't got the men, I haven't got the artillerymen, I haven't got any great confidence in some of these people you keep telling me to arm. They're turning up and collecting weapons, but I'm not seeing them back again. And, some of the people that he encounters on his march, for example, in Perthshire, he meets with a guy called Lord George Murray, and he makes Lord George Murray the deputy sheriff of Perthshire, and tasks him with creating food supply chain to feed his army as he moves up further into the Highlands. A few weeks later, Lord George Murray is Lieutenant General in the Jacobite army. So these are the challenges that Cope has in terms of trying to assess who he can trust, who he dares to arm, and of course he's got, as I say, that political pressure pushing him from the back. And so he's the decision at the Coriaric. Although with hindsight we know that the Jacobites weren't really in a position to resist him yet, he didn't know that, and I think it is sound to say that that's not a risk worth taking. And I think it's with one eye back to the politicians that he does sit his officers down and get them to agree. This is covered in the subsequent inquiry, but it's clear there was nobody who was arguing, yeah, of course we should go up into those mountain passes and try our hand against the Highlanders. What it also touches on is the fact that, as you say, you start to see every shadow in the Highlands as a potential threat, and the bogeymen are everywhere, and there does begin to be an overestimation in the army command, I think, of the strength of the Jacobite army at this point. And it becomes clear because the Jacobites are now directing the direction of operations. It's no longer the British army coming to them. As soon as those armies have started diverging, General Cope is having to respond to what the Jacobites are doing.
So, like you said, now we've got the Jacobite army is heading south and the government army is trying to catch up with them. What's their aim? If we're moving forward in our series of events, what's the next thing that this Jacobite army does?
So the Jacobite army's objective is now pretty clear. Its objective is Edinburgh. Now, in 1715, the Earl of Mar's Jacobite army, which was considerably bigger than Charles Edward's, occupied Perth and then stayed there. And that proved to be a massive strategic mistake. It allowed the government to concentrate its forces at Stirling, essentially blocking any further progress south, and it suffocated the momentum out of the military operation and drove it into the winter. So Charles Edward is not prepared to repeat those mistakes. He goes to Perth. He pauses at Perth because he knows he's got a little bit of space. General Cope is not in a position to intervene directly rapidly. So he pauses at Perth. There's a sort of famous anecdote where he supposedly rides into Perth holding up one coin, which is his last one, because he's actively trying to make sure that this is not going to be perceived in the lowlands as an army that is rapacious, and there'd been all sorts of challenges in previous Jacobite conflicts in 1715. After the Jacobites had to concede territory, they had to they burned their way through a number of villages to deny shelter to the pursuing redcoats, all of which damaged their reputation very severely. Charles Edward doesn't want to repeat those mistakes. So they're trying as best they can to pay for what they need as they go and to sustain a hearts and minds campaign. But he is running out of cash. So they pause in Perth, and a couple of important things happen there. Firstly, Lord George Murray, who I've already mentioned, the son of the, he's the brother of two Dukes of Perth, Dukes of Athol, one which is recognised by the government and one which is recognised by the Jacobites. So a divided family, if ever there was one. But George Murray, who served in the Jacobite army in 1719, he has also served briefly, although it's often enhanced and over-exaggerated in the British Army, and so has got some military experience, non-recent and non-particularly glorious. Nevertheless, he joins the Jacobite army, and he says, I had very high senior rank in 1719, therefore I need senior rank now. He had senior rank in 1719 because his brother was running the army. So nevertheless, he's made Lieutenant General. He has to share that post with the Duke of Perth, who also joins the Jacobite army here. Very committed, loyal Jacobite supporter, influential, popular, but as a rarity in the senior Jacobite command outside of Charles Edward and his Irish officers, he's also a Catholic. He's essentially the most senior Catholic nobleman in Scotland and one of the very few that are left. So Charles Edward gets an augmentation to his senior staff. It's a coup to get a duke and the brother of a duke onto the staff. It all builds the sort of social strength of the Jacobite army as well. They pause in Perth also to train. That's the second important addition. They actually have the best part of a week in Perth on the Inch by the river, where the army gets some training. There's efforts to create haversacks and a supply of meal for the soldiers. So that sort of evolution into an army begins really at Perth. And the third thing is that they now start presenting themselves as an administration as well as an army. And Charles Edward starts raising the funds for the campaign by levying taxes locally, by increasing them or adding them, saying you've got to pay the same taxes as you would to George II, you're just paying them to us now instead, and collecting voluntary contributions as well. So they're trying to find ways of raising the money that they need. So the stop in Perth is important. Meanwhile, General Cope is rushing across from Inverness to Aberdeen, assembling as much shipping as possible in Aberdeen on the basis that it will be more efficient to sail the army down the east coast of Scotland and get it to Edinburgh by sea than to try and rush down in the wake of the Jacobites over land. As soon as Charles Edward, though, feels that his pause at Perth has achieved what he needs in the short term, he gets it in motion again. And we see this time and time again. Charles Edward is always reluctant to sit still for too long, and he gets moving. The next objective is Stirling and the crossings of the Forth, where repeatedly over previous generations and centuries, armies have come unstuck at trying to force the crossings around Stirling. But it was a hugely strategic, important location at the site of an important British garrison. Charles Edward is in no position to contest the castle there. But by now, he's got the best part of 2,500 men in arms. So he has grown his army considerably on that route. And again, it's one of the reasons for pausing a little bit of time in Perth is that it allows people that are joining to catch up with him. So they cross the River Forth at a series of fords that are just upstream from Stirling itself. The castle fires its guns in defiance, but can't do anything to stop them. What should have been able to do something to stop them, though, is the 700 or so regular dragoons that have been left to protect the lowlands. The 13th and the 14th regiments of dragoons, Gardiner's and Hamilton's regiments, as I alluded to, had been left behind by General Cope because they weren't considered suitable for campaigning in the north. And even against 2,500 pretty much untrained Highland soldiers, those 700 dragoons should have been able to at least make life uncomfortable during this campaign. Now that they're in the lowlands and now that they've got freedom of movement, the Jacobite army doesn't have tented encampments that it can put up. It doesn't have the capacity to erect fieldworks. It's billeting over wide areas. Those dragoons could potentially have been very troublesome for the Jacobite army, but they aren't. One regiment is left to protect the roads to Edinburgh, and Gardiner's regiment slowly withdraws from Stirling a day or so ahead of the Jacobites as they keep moving forwards, in the hope that they will be falling back on General Cope's disembarkation at some point. So essentially, the Jacobite march south is is unopposed as the army progresses to and then over the crossings of the Forth of Stirling, and then they're just a matter of days from the capital. So it becomes a race to see whether Johnny Cope's ships can get to the port of Leith and disembark there before the Jacobites can fight their way into the capital.
And so the Jacobites, they make their way to Edinburgh, and they do end up capturing the capital, correct?
Yeah, so the civil authorities in Edinburgh have professed their loyalty to King George, as you would expect, and they have made a few attempt to prepare themselves for a defence of the city. Edinburgh is a really interesting space. Anybody who's visited it will be familiar with the fact that the old town clusters along this volcanic ridge. The new town had not been built by this point, so it's still very much within its medieval bounds. It is walled. The 16th century town walls still encompass most of the city, but of course they weren't designed to defend against artillery. Well, that's lucky because the Jacobites haven't got any of that. So there is a belief that a determined resistance could prevent the Jacobites from taking Edinburgh. It had worked in 1715, where Edinburgh's civil authorities had been able to hold out against the Jacobites, who took the port but couldn't get into the city simply because the city shut the gates. So the Jacobite army is concerned about this. They know that Charles Edward's plan for the conduct of the campaign does not involve him fighting through the streets of Edinburgh, potentially doing huge damage, and even if he's successful. So there's an element here of bravado to be employed. As the Jacobites are approaching the capital, they are sending messengers ahead saying, "This is your legitimate prince. We expect to be welcomed and received. We don't want to have to, but we will, if necessary, take action against the city." The city itself is very much sort of shrugging and saying, well, it's the army's responsibility to have been protecting the city. Where is the army? Where's General Cope? Why hasn't he got through? Of course, once the Jacobites have come through Perthshire, it's much harder for communication between General Cope and the city. So there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of confusion. There's also a lot of Jacobite sympathy in the capital. It was once, of course, the home of the Stuart dynasty at Edinburgh Castle and then Holyrood Palace, that empty royal palace that was a sort of visible symbol to the city of its lack of status in the new order, if you like. And so there was certainly sympathy there, and the city was coming up towards an election, so there were counter-accusations and accusations about whether the provost and the magistrates were Jacobite sympathisers or not. The old trained bands were considered to be suspicious because there were reports that many of the volunteers within them were Jacobite sympathisers. So it's very difficult in this sort of climate for the civil authorities to make any meaningful defence of the city. There was also a lot of concern, certainly early on in this process, as to the legality of raising troops. The provost had been very concerned about raising a militia regiment, for example, without getting express permission from London to do it, because he didn't want to be seen raising troops when there was a potential uprising in case he was accused of being sympathetic to it. But of course, that means that there are weeks of delays in him actually mobilising, which left him open to accusation that he was deliberately delaying. So there are all these things going off inside the walls of Edinburgh, and scenes that occasionally seem almost farcical, as meetings are called and disbanded, volunteers are put on the walls and then moved off the walls, and there is a sense that they're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. If you close the gates and offer resistance, and then the Jacobites force the issue, then the city is open to sack or to a pretty hard time from these Highlanders that Edinburgh citizens are traditionally quite wary of letting in. And but if you don't offer resistance, and the expectation is that once General Cope arrives, the Jacobites will be dispersed, then the city is open to punishment from King George. So very difficult situation for the defenders. They try to raise a regiment of militia, but people prefer to serve as volunteers. So we've got people coming in and out of the city in arms, and this made the civil authorities very nervous. Eventually, the Edinburgh Castle garrison starts to try collecting in as much of these weapons as possible because it's losing control of who's got what. Very chaotic scenes in Edinburgh. The Jacobites approaching closer and closer. The dragoons don't inspire a great deal of confidence in the city, being the only regular troops within sight. They have a little panic when they're just not far from where Murrayfield Stadium is today. They saw the vanguard of the Jacobite army, and a few of the Jacobite scouts popped a few shots off at the pickets. It created a bit of a panic, and the dragoons withdrew in a very disorderly way, but with great speed, to the port of Leith, all of which is visible from the tenements in Edinburgh, and did a lot to undermine the civilians' confidence. The Jacobites still have this problem, though. Even if the city's in a state of chaos, all it has to do is close the gates, and then the Jacobites have got a challenge. So the Jacobites don't know how to respond to that challenge. They are bluffing, sending threatening messages into the city, and they post forces around some of the city gates to keep an eye on things and to sort of block the city up. And then this extraordinary event happens on the night of the 16th, 17th of September, where the city sends a delegation to Charles Edward to try and negotiate with him and buy themselves a bit of time. They want time because they can see in the distance down the Firth of Forth the masts of ships that are assumed to be General Cope's army. So a bit of time will hopefully solve this problem for the city. Charles Edward can also see that, so he doesn't want to negotiate in a protracted way. But the carriage which carries the delegation from the city council to the Jacobite camp, when it returns to the city, it passes on its message. The city are very anxious. But then, late in the night, that carriage returns to its stables, and its stables are just outside the city gates on the Canongate. And so the city gates are opened to allow that carriage to return to its stables. On the other side of that gate is John Sullivan and Cameron of Lochiel and a large party of Highlanders who, frankly, can't believe their luck. The city gate has been opened in the middle of the night, and they rush the gate. They find literally a handful of town guardsmen on the gates and nobody else. So in the end, the Jacobites are able to systematically disarm the remaining guards that are on the gates of Edinburgh, march up the high street, demand keys to the old Parliament Hall so that they've got somewhere to sleep, and then dictate the terms of the city's capitulation to the provost, who's had a pretty restless few nights. Now, they would put the provost on trial twice for this failure of the defence of the city, and it remains a controversial assessment. Was the opening of the gates in the middle of that night a deliberate option that allowed plausible deniability to the defenders, but prevented the Jacobites having to storm the city? Was it simple incompetence? I actually, based on the way that the defences had been conducted up to that point, have a strong suspicion it was. Or was it an honest mistake? The reality of the situation, though, is that the Jacobites occupy the capital on the 17th of September. Charles Edward is able to arrive in person later that day. We are told that something like 30-odd thousand people flock to the Royal Park to witness Charles Edward entering the palace of his ancestors, which is quite remarkable considering that it's considerably bigger than the population of the city. So either our sources are lying to us, or they can't count, or people were coming from far and wide. It depends on on how you want to read that. But what is clear is that the scene was almost ecstatically jubilant. Reports of people reaching up to touch Charles Edward as he tried to press through the crowds. He tried to dismount so that he could walk amongst the people, but was forced to get back on his horse because so great was the press around him. These are, I don't think, scenes of a mass discovery of Jacobite sympathy. I think they are a genuine expression of excitement and curiosity at the idea of a royal steward returning to the royal Stuart palace. This is something that had not been seen for generations in Edinburgh, and regardless of the outcome of the conflict, it was something everybody wanted to witness. Charles Edward enters the palace, which is outside the city walls. But the city has been secured. Later on, the heralds are persuaded to don their tabards and proclaim King James VIII and III at the Market Cross of Edinburgh. So this is something that has not been achieved by any Jacobite campaign through the long conflict so far. The capital city has been taken. The prince is in the palace. King James has been proclaimed at the cross. None of which avoids the simple realities that Edinburgh Castle is still held for George II and is almost impossible for the Jacobites to attempt to take without an artillery train, and that the Firth of Forth contains a fleet of transports with General Cope's army in it. So it's a triumphal moment for the prince, but it is not, by any stretch of the imagination, job done. Without fighting General Cope and forcing that issue, everything that he's achieved so far can be seen either as General Cope's mistakes or Charles Edward's good luck.
I mean, being proclaimed king, that couldn't have gone, again, unnoticed in England. Was there a specific reaction to that, or did they not get word of that before the actual engagement at Prestonpans?
Yeah, that's the problem, is that they come within days of each other, and so this wave of bad news hits London. I mean, the news travels pretty fast and pretty efficiently, but yeah, they hit the desks pretty quickly, one after the other. Edinburgh's fallen, and well, that's okay because General Cope will salvage the situation. Oh, hold on. General Cope has also been completely defeated, and so that's the problem, and that's the fact that those two pieces of news come hot on the heels of each other. As I say, General Cope is still the key player. He no longer has a sort of numerical superiority, but he has regular soldiers, he has dragoons, and he has artillery, however improvised his train of crews might be. And so on paper, there's still no reason to panic. It's unfortunate that Edinburgh has been lost. It's unfortunate that the Jacobites weren't contained in the Highlands. But this isn't yet a crisis. It's a frustration. So General Cope disembarks his army. Unfortunately, he's not able to get up the Firth of Forth. I mean, this was a tight race. He nearly made it, but wind and tide are against him. He can't get up the Firth of Forth in time to defend Edinburgh. So he disembarks at the town of Dunbar, which is about 30 miles to the east of Edinburgh, and positions him well because he's now got his back to the border, where they are expecting Dutch troops to land in support. That's one of the things the government has done in the hope of bringing extra troops in, and so those are expected in the north of England pretty imminently by General Cope. But he's not worried about that, in the sense that his objective is the immediate recovery of Edinburgh. General Cope and his officers, even in the subsequent inquiry, are keen to stress that the men seem to be in good spirits. There was no real spreading sense of despondency. But once he disembarks at Dunbar, what he's greeted with is two fairly depressing things. One is the sort of crowd of refugee civic officers and that have come out of Edinburgh and are waiting to tell him at Dunbar just how terrifying the Highlanders look, and just how many of them there are, and just how incompetent the city's authorities were. And the second thing that awaits him is, of course, the two regiments of dragoons, who have had a pretty undistinguished campaign so far. Things had gone bad to worse after their sort of ignominious retreat from nothing from Coltbridge. They had then retreated to a little town called Prestonpans, and that was Colonel Gardner, who was commander of one of the dragoon regiments. That was his hometown, and he went to have a nap in his house here at Bankton House, which still stands. And then all of a sudden, an alarm goes. The Jacobites have not paused in Edinburgh at all. They've followed the dragoons straight to Prestonpans. They're here. They're attacking, and both regiments mount up and during the night and flee. Because they can't resist the whole Jacobite army on their own, and they bolt out of Prestonpans. Some of them go down the coast road, some of them go down the high road. Nobody's quite sure where any of the officers are. It takes ages for anybody to wake Colonel Gardner up and get him out of his house. Scenes of complete chaos. And one of the eyewitnesses locally here, the minister's son, says that when he got up the next morning, he saw there was sort of discarded skull caps and bits of equipment lying down the roads leading out of town. It turned out that the rumour of the Jacobite attack had been spread by some of the local farmers who didn't want their freshly cut harvest to be used to feed these dragoon horses that had suddenly descended on the town. So this is the state of the two dragoon regiments that meet General Cope at Dunbar, who are somewhat embarrassed by their own performance and also have to report that they'd left all of their baggage and equipment in Edinburgh and had essentially therefore made a gift of it to the Jacobites. So even if Cope's men weren't feeling despondent, I think the general might have been rubbing his eyes a little bit by this point, thinking that this campaign is not exactly going the way that I had wanted it to, and that nobody is fulfilling the tasks that he's set them. So he does stay for a couple of days in Dunbar, largely to allow the dragoons to compose themselves, I think, and for him to get an assessment of the Jacobite strength. There are plenty of people, as I've said, giving him assessments of the Jacobite strength, some of which are more reliable than the others. But we know, if we could believe people like John Hume, who fights as a volunteer for the government at various points during the war and later writes a history of it, he says that he sat in the Royal Park at Holyrood, and he counted the Highlanders, and it was really easy because he waited until it was lunchtime, basically, and they all lined up to get their rations. And so whilst they were all queuing up, he counts them. And then he rides out, unchallenged, all the way to Dunbar, and he tells General Cope exactly how many he thinks there are. Now, our only source for this is John Hume himself, let's be fair, but it does suggest that General Cope has access to some good intelligence, but they are civilian sources, and I suspect he's treating them with a degree of scepticism, because there are also plenty of people who are overinflating the Jacobite numbers. And so, nevertheless, his decision is that he is going to march directly to challenge them. So that's what he does. After, as I say, a few days to compose the army, he heads off on a direct course to confront them, and if necessary, to confront them in Edinburgh or close to Edinburgh, where he can potentially have the support of the several hundred men that are in the garrison of the castle as well. So that's his objective. He needs to force a battle in order to prove that this is still contained. I've still got this under control. Don't worry about it.
Yes, obviously we're getting then, Arran, to the crux of the episode, to the battle itself. I mean, you in your book, which certainly wasn't the first book that's been written on the battle, but I mean, one of the things that stood out in your account was the way you portray it really as a 2-day engagement. So could you start off by telling us about the first day, the preliminaries, if you like, and how things kicked off then?
Yeah, absolutely. This, as you say, this has been a sort of a little campaign that I've been waging for a few years, and it's partly a response to the fact that often Prestonpans is described as being one of the shortest battles in Scottish history, which somehow I think in itself sort of diminishes its significance. But also, I think it would be not recognised by the people who lost their lives the day before. So there are important things that happen on the 20th of September. General Cope marches out of Dunbar and he heads to Haddington on the 18th. He stops at Haddington there to re-water the men and prepare them. There's an interesting incident there where the vanguard of General Cope's army spots on the horizon a large gathering coming down the road, and it is assumed to be the Jacobite vanguard, which somehow seems to be able to teleport itself all over the county at this point, and is always being reported as being seen miles from where it could possibly be. And the whole army draws up in order of battle near Haddington to receive the Jacobite attack, only to discover that it's a wedding party on its way back from its festivities. So you get these little anecdotes that sort of start to hint at a jitteriness. It's that point of where does caution and preparedness start to look like anxiety. But nevertheless, on the 20th, the Jacobite army, hearing confirmation that General Cope is marching westwards, Prince decides that he's going to march eastwards to meet it. He does not want to fight a battle in Edinburgh or around Edinburgh. He doesn't want to worry about potential sallies from the castle behind him. And so the Jacobite army marches out of Edinburgh on the 20th. General Cope moves out of Haddington the same morning, and Prestonpans turns out to be the battlefield simply because it's halfway between Edinburgh and Haddington, essentially. There's much to the disappointment of people here. There's no inherent strategic significance to the location. It's just that it's the collision point between the two armies. This is an interesting area, close to the capital, where Prestonpans is 10 miles out to the east of Edinburgh. It's a coastal town. At the time in the 18th century, in fact, right up until the middle of the 20th century, it was actually two separate towns: Prestonpans, which is a salt panning area, which used to be owned by monks, which is why it's the priest's town with the pans. And then there was an inland settlement as well, the little market town, which was Preston. So those two communities side by side, one on the coast, one just inland. And they are on a fairly open, relatively flat coastal plain leading down to the shores of the Firth of Forth. But on the south side of what becomes the battlefield area, there's a very significant rise and a ridge line that runs quite a long distance for a good number of miles across this part of the county. And that ridge line has at its top the town of Trinent. And that is also where the main road from Edinburgh to London runs. So that was the high road up on that ridge line. And because it was a high road and the town of Trinent was sitting on it and its trade was dependent on the road, of course, it means that the area around that road in that area is quite heavily enclosed. There's also a lot of coal mining taking place around there, and there had been for hundreds of years already. And so the landscape is mottled with coal bell pits and open pits, enclosures. So not exactly an army-friendly space up there on the top of the ridge. So what General Cope decides to do as he's marching towards that ridge is to move off it. So he comes down onto the coast road so that he's moving on the coastal plain, which gives him a much more open landscape in which to operate, which, considering the fact that he's got a superiority in cavalry and in firepower, ought to be to his advantage. So he moves down onto the coastal plain. Charles Edward, on the other hand, is moving into this landscape from the opposite end. And, of course, he wants to be in the area where he thinks he can get an advantage. He's told by George Murray, who claims to know the area very well, nobody's quite sure how or why, that they'd be better off on the high ground, which makes sense. So the Jacobites actually cut off the road and they come up the slopes onto the ridge to secure position on the ridge, controlling the road that they assume General Cope will be coming on. And they seem to have the expectation that General Cope's men will come up through the village of Trinent, up the main road, through those enclosures and coal pits where they'll struggle to deploy, and that will help neutralise the advantage they have in cavalry, and will allow the Jacobites to then launch a charge. But once the Jacobites get onto that ridge, of course, they then see that the British army is marching into the landscape on the plain instead. This is even better because it means the Jacobites have got the high ground and will be able to launch this sweeping attack down from the heights. So the two armies come into sight of each other for the first time, it should be said, in the 4 weeks that they've been marching, on the afternoon of the 20th of September, about 1 o'clock. And there's a number of accounts that say the armies jeered and cursed and swore at each other as they came into sight. Now, I have tried jeering and cursing and swearing at somebody from the ridge, and they cannot hear you down at the bottom. It is still a considerable distance away, but I'm sure they could guess what each other were saying. But there is this sense that comes through from the accounts from both sides that both armies were up for the fight by this point. But actually, it proves to be an almost non-starter because the Jacobites, smugly having secured the high ground, then send some pickets down the slopes to check the approach to the British lines as the British army is deploying. And they quickly find that at the bottom of the slope, the ground is extremely wet, extremely boggy and marshy. And that's just the local geography, is that the ridge line is relatively imporous, and the rain all collects down at the foot. And so you have this run of marshland across the face of that ridge, which is frustrating if you want a battle, because we have now an army on either side of that marshland with no way of getting to grips with its opposite number. So there then follows, during the afternoon of the 20th of September, a series of manoeuvres as the two armies are probing about to see what the best opportunity is. This is a sort of proto-industrial landscape. I've already alluded to the fact that there's quite a large amount of enclosure happening in parts. There's coal mining, there's salt panning on the coastal strip, and actually between the coast and the ridge, there's the first railway line that was ever built in Scotland as well. This was put down in 1722, I should say. It's a wooden wagon track to take the coal to the coast from the ridge so that it can fire up the salt pans and boil the water. And now that wooden railway track running through the battlefield has to cross the bogs. And so it crosses the bogs on a raised trackway and a dry bed, therefore. So there is dry access across the marsh in that centre point, which happens to also lead directly to the edge of Trinent village, where there's a church with a walled enclosure overlooking the wagonway. So one of the things that John Sullivan in the Jacobite army does, calling back on his experience in the French army, is to establish that churchyard as a strong point that controls the access over the marshes. So the Jacobites secure that point with about 50 men from Clan Cameron. Whilst they're doing that, the Jacobites are probing round to the west side to see if there are approaches around that side that they could make. But that's a pretty awkward approach to the battlefield because it has to go through the town of Preston, through a series of enclosures and park walls there, which General Cope has already started knocking some holes in the walls so that he can move his men into them and defend the enclosures if the Jacobites come that way. So there's a lot of movement happening here. But there's also a lot of misinterpretation of these movements. Every time the Jacobite army shifts its position, the British army shifts its position in response. Now, that's unnerving the Jacobites because it feels like no matter where they probe, the British army is always able to respond. But it also seems to be encouraging others to think, well, actually, but the British army is not in control of this situation. It is purely reacting to what the Jacobites are doing. It's not making a plan of its own. The Jacobites then decide to move as much of their army out of sight as possible. So they tuck behind the lip of the ridge and into the town of Trinent so that not so many of them are visible. So we now have a situation where the Jacobites can see everything the British army does. The British army can only see what the Jacobite army chooses it to see. The Jacobites seem to make a big show of waving the Prince's standard around and making it clear where that is as a means of fixing the British Army's attention. They make a few probes around to the west, but they're getting frustrated. They can't get to grips with the enemy, and they don't have a plan how they can do it. And they start to fall out with each other. And this is something that I'm sure over the next few parts of this series we will come back to. But the Jacobite officers start to fall out with each other over what they are doing and what they should do. And crucial to this sort of little triumvirate at the core of the Jacobite army is Charles Edward, George Murray, and John Sullivan. The Prince, the Irishman, and the Scotsman, essentially. So it's not a joke. But Lord George Murray, as well as being Lieutenant General, he's also the head of the Athol Brigade, the Athol regiments in the Jacobite army that have been raised in North Perthshire. And when Sullivan orders part of the Athol Brigade to be moved on the battlefield out towards the west in a probe, Lord George Murray objects because he, as regimental officer of those units, hasn't been consulted. So he complains about it. In fact, he complains about it, threatens to resign, and throws his gun to the floor in a fit of pique, if you believe O'Sullivan's account. So there's a tension developing here. And to try and smooth this out, Charles Edward orders the regiments back to the ridgeline. Now, the British army is trying to observe this, and it's got civilian observers up the church tower in Prestonpans watching this, and they see the Jacobites moving men down and then moving back again, and they're wondering what sort of nefarious plan these guys are up to. And of course, every time the Jacobites move, the British army moves in response. And so there is this increasing sense of actually, what's going on here? And this sort of seeping fear that something is up that we can't quite see or understand. There is then an exchange of fire. A few shots had been fired at the Jacobite pickets at Henry Kerr, who'd gone down into the marshland earlier, but it's not really until late afternoon that the first shots are exchanged in earnest. And this focuses on the wagonway around Trinent Churchyard. Basically, General Cope sends a scout up that road, a guy called Walter Grosset. He's a civilian in the sense, but he's the exciseman from Alloy. And he volunteers to go up the wagonway and have a look to see if he can see what the Jacobites are up to. When he goes up, he comes into range of those 50 men from Clan Cameron that are posted around the edge of the churchyard at the top of the wagonway. And they just can't resist the temptation, so they shoot at him. Now, they all miss, and I suspect he trots down that track a lot quicker than he'd gone up it. This was his second attempt to go up. When he'd gone up the first time, he'd seen nothing. When he went up the second time, obviously the Camerons had been posted in between the two, and so he must have got the fright of his life. And he went back to report that I think the Jacobites have occupied that churchyard, sir. And General Cope responds by firing a couple of his artillery pieces. Now, these are 1.5 pounders. So they're not big guns, but nevertheless, they fire on the churchyard, and they kill a chap called Arran Cameron of Clunes, who's the first casualty of the battle, and wound a few others. It's a bit impenetrable, this bit. There are various names and numbers given for casualties at this point. I think Alan Cameron is wounded that day, but I think he dies actually the following. But nevertheless, casualties are taken by the Jacobites, and they fall out with each other again. Now it's Donald Cameron of Lochiel who says, "Why are my men getting shot at by artillery, sat in this position from which they can't fire back?" And Sullivan, I suspect, says, "Well, if they hadn't been shooting at random passers-by, then they wouldn't have exposed their position," and so on. And so, again, the compromise is that the men are withdrawn from the outer areas of the churchyard. But the churchyard itself, as a walled enclosure, is too valuable. They clearly keep a picket there, and some of the Jacobite officers' horses are crucially picketed there during the rest of the evening and into the night. But the Jacobites have decided by nightfall that there is no valid western approach onto the battlefield, and there's no approach for them to make that's sensible from the south side. So they start shifting the weight of the army round to the eastern side of Trinent on the ridge. And as they do so, General Cope senses that it's clear that the Jacobites aren't sure where to attack from, but that the most likely position still remains for them to come down that wagonway and across the marshes there. So Cope remains facing southwards in his line during as we move into the night of the 20th. And pickets, a considerable number of pickets, as you would expect, are kept out. There's nice references in some of the accounts from those who were there that they can hear on the wind the conversations of the pickets on the other side of the marshes. The Jacobites, during the late evening, sort of 9 o'clock-ish, fire a few shots around on the western side of the battlefield near Colonel Gardner's house, and those pickets there have to be reinforced. Now, we know that by that point the Jacobites are concentrating on the eastern side of the battlefield. So I think that is a deliberate attempt to misdirect and to keep attention fixed over on that side of the field whilst the Jacobites are shifting the other way. But the Jacobites go into that night with a dilemma, because if they move continuously eastwards and try to attack from the eastern side of the battlefield, they are giving Cope the road to Edinburgh. And Cope may well decline battle and simply march his army back to the capital, retake Edinburgh, and this time the Jacobites would have a much harder task getting it back. So that, it is a gamble for them to focus their attention that side and to willingly cut themselves off from any line of retreat back to the north. But they are, at this point, as the 20th of September comes to an end, in a position where they have to force a battle. Charles Edward knows that he can't now decline battle, or the sort of momentum and persona that is built up to this point will dissipate. So he has to be prepared to take risks. And so that's the situation as we head into the night. The British Army, it often gets overlooked, but it also does make an attempt to shell Trinent with its mortars and drop some explosive bombs into the areas where it expects the Jacobites to be overnight. But only a few shots are fired because the bombs don't explode. The excuse given at the inquiry is that the fuses were damnified by storage in Edinburgh Castle, which is just a phrase that I like, and so I repeat it whenever I can. But there's a moment in the account of David Williams, Lord Elcho, who was one of the Prince's senior officers, where he says he's riding on the battlefield with Charles Edward that evening, and one of the bombs fired by the mortars lands just in front of him and Charles Edward on the slopes outside Trinent. So it's, from the Jacobites' perspective, a pretty good job that those fuses had been damnified, because the war might well have ended there. Now, nobody else tells us that story, and I suspect that's not because Lord Elcho made it up. I suspect it's because him and the Prince decided they probably want to not tell anybody just how close they'd come to a bit of an embarrassing end to the campaign there.
Wow. It really sounds like that first day is a battle of maneuvers and preparatory actions for the next day.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand what happens on that first day in order to understand what happens the following. And I do think that during the course of that day, the fact that the British Army had been so reactive, but at no stage managed to actually successfully gain the initiative or determine what actions were happening, must have had a sort of sapping effect on morale to some degree. I don't want to overstate it, but they are clearly concerned. They are clearly expecting the Jacobites to do something. They hear over the course of the later into the night, they hear all the dogs in Trinent start barking. So they know the Jacobites are moving around in the darkness up there, but they don't know where they're going or what they're up to. And it's a bit like what we were talking about at the Corriaric. They're now starting to build up in their minds this sense of these Highlanders that don't play by the same rules that we do. And we're not sure what's coming or where it's coming from, and I think that might have settled in people's minds during that night as they lay there in the open field. They don't set up a camp, as you'd expect with the enemy so close. They lie in their arms. The field that they're in is freshly cropped. The harvest has just been taken in. So this is a fairly open landscape that they're in, although there's lots of things in it. There's good visibility around the site when it's daylight. But once it's dark, then you hear those dogs barking in the distance. I can imagine how that would work on your nerves a little bit. It's worth saying that there's a tradition that grows very, very quickly after the battle, almost as an excuse, that these soldiers are substandard, that they're green, ineffective troops, and they obviously weren't fit for being sent out to Flanders or whatever, and they're the second-rate home garrison. Of course, it's grossly unfair. Many of them haven't seen a field action before. That's reasonable, but that's no great difference at all to their Jacobite opponents. They have some very experienced officers with them, and most of them have been in the army for years. So even if they haven't seen a field action, they are trained professional soldiers. So I think it's worth saying that, just dispel this idea that these were somehow second-rate soldiers. That I think emerges very clearly. Nobody's talking about that before the battle. I think that is a post-event justification.
And so these guys are sleeping out under arms that night, and then when the sun comes up, what happens next?
Yeah, so they don't even have to wait for the sun. They hear a signal gun fire. The British Army is by no means not expecting something to happen. They've got plenty of pickets out, and the details of where they were posted were discussed in great detail at the subsequent inquiry, and so we get a good picture of how the British Army is posted around the landscape. But the thinner end of their picket screen is, of course, on the western side, the eastern side, which is the area from which they had come, and therefore the area from which an attack was least likely. But they still, nevertheless, had patrols out there. Now, what happens sometime after midnight is that a gent called Robert Anderson speaks to to Lord George Murray first, and then Lord George Murray goes and wakes the Prince. Anderson's information is that he knows the marshes. He knows that there is a track through the marshes near the little village of Seaton. It's not a wide one. It's not a particularly useful one for any usual purposes. It's just a track that's used by shooters who are shooting at the birds in the marshes. But nevertheless, it's there, and it leads to a wooden crossing. There is a deep drainage ditch running parallel with the marshes as well. which is another obstacle on the field, and it crosses that ditch with a small wooden bridge. So Anderson gives this very good information to the Jacobite High Command. Now, in popular novels and TV shows, Anderson often becomes the helpful local lad who guides the Jacobite army to victory. That's actually a bit unfair to him. He is a committed Jacobite. He's already in the Jacobite army. He's senior. He's on the quartermaster's staff. His father had been out in 1715. These are gentlemen of some status locally, and so he is not just some Johnny helpful local. He's committed and in the cause, and so he gives this information. And the prince orders the track to be reconnoitred. It is acknowledged that it is a risky operation because it is such a narrow track through the marshes, and if there is a substantial guard at the back end of it, the Jacobites would struggle to force a way through. So the decision that's made after a brief council of war in the field there is that the Jacobites will move down through that trackway in order to deploy on the eastern side of the battlefield. So they're giving up the high ground in order to get across the marshes and force a battle. The Jacobite army is not trained and capable enough, and I think everybody acknowledges this, to attempt any complicated nocturnal maneuverings. So the intention is to do this just before the dawn, so that the army is able to arrive and deploy as the sun is coming up, and so then they can launch an attack by daylight, is essentially the point. So they're not trying to launch a night attack or anything as complex and potentially risky as that. But nevertheless, it's a complex and dangerous maneuver. They begin the march at about 4 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of September. The way that the army's command has been divided up by this point is that the van, or what will become the right wing once deployed, is led by the Duke of Perth in his early 30s. I've mentioned him earlier. Energetic, popular, Catholic Highland nobleman. Perth's division is comprised almost exclusively of the MacDonald regiments, the Clandonald. Lord George Murray, he has the left of the front line. He has the largest Jacobite regiment on the field, the Clan Cameron, the Stuarts of Appin, and the Duke of Perth's own regiment. So he has that wing there. The second line of the Jacobite army is commanded by Charles Edward in person, with Lord Nairn in support. And that's the Athol, what becomes the Athol Brigade, and the Robertsons and a few others. Units that are drawn from the Highland-Lowland division line, essentially. So the army goes into the march, and it's worth remembering this is the first time they've done this. This is the first time that the Duke of Perth has deployed an army on the battlefield. It's the first time Charles Edward has deployed an army on the battlefield. It's the first time Lord George Murray has deployed an army this large on the battlefield. 2,500 men now, so it's by European standards and the things that you've been discussing in previous episodes. This is not a big army, but it feels pretty big if you're doing it all for the first time. And they make a cock-up of it, essentially. And Lord George Murray doesn't want to move his left flank too far away from the protection of the marshes and the ditch. So he tries to stay close to that end, the south side of the field. Ahead of him, though, the Duke of Perth, who's moving into the open landscape with no real landmarks in front of him, he wants to make sure that he leaves plenty of room for everybody else, and so he moves his division much further north than is necessary. So there is a big gap in the Jacobite front line. The prince himself, leading the second line into the field, deploys the reserve behind that gap. And so that's the saving feature of the deployment, because obviously from the British line, they don't see the gap. They see the second line behind and assume that they're looking at a continuous front line. If General Cope had been able to have an aerial view of this operation, he would have seen that pumping his 700 dragoons straight up the middle of the Jacobite army would have split it in half and taken the prince in the first few minutes. But he didn't have those advantages, of course. So the Jacobites do not deploy particularly well. Neither, however, does the British army. So the British army detects the Jacobite approach. A signal cannon is fired to alert the army. The army rises up and forms as it had the previous day, facing south. It's then immediately informed, of course, that the threat is coming from the east. So the whole British line is wheeled into a new position, facing directly east. There was a lot of effort in the inquiry to examine this point. Was the British line fully deployed and ready to receive the enemy attack? Yes, is the categorical answer. The Jacobites say that too. So the line moves into position, seems to take about 12 minutes based on the inquiry evidence. But having moved the army at about 5 o'clock in the morning into a new position, the deployment is not perfect. The main issue is that the 6 guns have not been distributed along the line as you would perhaps expect for these sort of infantry support size guns. They are clustered together at the right-hand end of Cope's line. He does seem to make an attempt to move them, but is told that the horses have already been withdrawn and that there aren't the men available in the crews to manhandle them into new positions quickly. So he leaves them there. That means because of the ditch on the flank, there isn't actually enough room to deploy the full regiment of dragoons that had been expected. So whilst one squadron of each regiment of dragoons is held as the reserve, otherwise there is no reserve line behind the British infantry, the 2 squadrons remaining from each regiment are posted on the flanks. But Gardiner's regiment of dragoons is stuffed in amongst the artillery and has very little room for manoeuvre. Now, by the misfortune of the way that the Jacobites have deployed as well, they are directly facing the Clan Cameron, which is the biggest regiment in the Jacobite army, 600 men, and one of the better equipped and seemingly more disciplined units as well. So the British Army's deployment isn't exactly perfect either. It's a thin line. It's obviously in its standard positions. It's 3 men deep. And as I say, apart from the 2 squadrons of dragoons that have been held in the rear, there is no second line. Cope's original intended order of battle had allowed for a second line comprised of civilian volunteers, most of whom he'd tried to disperse along the march because he didn't really trust them very much, and the Highland companies that he'd brought with him, company of the Black Watch and some fairly half-raised companies from Loudon's Highlanders. But these were, in the event, left as a baggage guard as the line was deployed. So there is no second line behind the British foot. So everything depends on that Highland attack being broken up by the platoon fire of the British infantry, by the impact of the artillery fire on the right, and then, if sufficiently disordered, by the capacity of the dragoons to then break them up and disperse them. On paper, that should have all been completely possible. The Jacobites don't hang around on the battlefield once they're in position, partly because they realise, obviously, that they have not got a single continuous front line, so they need to address that, but also because they're now in an open field with the sun coming up and facing a professional army that has a much higher firepower and disciplined firepower, of course, is the key difference. The Jacobite army is, though, is not a ragtag by this point. It has been consolidating and it has been collecting guns. That's the important thing. There are a number of witnesses from the British Army, including people like Lieutenant Colonel Shugborough Whitney, who make a point of saying that the Jacobites lay down a significant amount of fire during their attack. And we're finding it on the battlefield. There are a lot of musket balls on the field, and a lot of smaller ones that we think are probably French issues that are certainly smaller than the standard brown vest. So there's plenty of shot being sent out by the Jacobite army. Shug Whitney does say that, I wouldn't have had a squadron left if everything that they fired at us had hit something. The implication being that the Jacobites are firing irregularly and probably on the move and are then attacking through the smoke of their own musketry. So the Jacobite attack, when it comes, is very rapid. The Highland charge, though, isn't a sort of wild, every man running for himself as fast as he can, as we like to imagine it, largely because you don't want to reach the enemy on your own or out of puff. So it is disciplined. British officer-informed plans of the battlefield almost always show the Jacobites as approaching in columns. And what they're trying to interpret there is, I think, the way that the line contracts from its line into clusters based on the clans. So they'll be tightly packed. The officers and the senior gentlemen of the clan at the front, the poorer, the lowlier, the poorer equipped, packed in at the back to provide momentum. They fire on the move as they go forwards and then draw swords for the charge. So it's an attack that builds momentum as it crosses the field. And as I say, that line contracts into these tight clusters, which means, of course, that some of the British platoons have got nothing to shoot at as the line contracts into these groups. And then, of course, it charges across the field very rapidly. The instinct, of course, is for the British to countercharge with their dragoons. That's the intention, certainly, of Whitney, who commands the 2 squadrons on the British right. But everything almost immediately falls apart for the British army. The artillery crews flee, and they are a mixed bag, as I've already alluded to. Some of these are sailors that have been brought in from a frigate called the Fox, which is just off the coast of Prestonpans during the battle. And they probably decide, looking at 600 men from Clancameron coming through the early morning light, that they'd rather be back aboard. So they shift themselves very quickly. That leaves just the officers of the artillery train to actually fire the pieces. And that's Eaglesfield Griffiths, master gunner from Edinburgh Castle, and Charles Whitefoot, who was from the Marines but had been on holiday in Scotland when it all kicked off, so had done his bit to volunteer. And those 2 officers fire the guns. We know that they fire grape because we're finding it on the battlefield. And there's a description of the Highlanders shuddering to a stop in their assault when the cannons fire, pulling their bonnets down over their brows and then surging on all the quicker, presumably on the basis that it's easier to charge into cannons that you're not looking at. What the Jacobites obviously aren't aware of is that those cannons cannot be reloaded because the crews are already running. So the Clancameron very quickly overwhelms that gun line. The attempt by the dragoons to countercharge fails almost immediately. Shugborough Whitney, who's leading the operation, is shot and wounded and drops out the saddle. And the dragoons clustered around those cannons don't stick around. They try to withdraw. As they withdraw, they disorder the artillery guard and their own reserve squadron behind them, and the panic seems to spread like fire through that end of the line at that point. Similarly, at the opposite end of the line, the Hamilton's dragoons, because the Duke of Perth had led his men a little bit further north than had been intended, they were worried about being outflanked, and so they tried to refuse the flank a little bit up there on the British left. As you refuse, though, from that position, the ground rises slightly to your rear. And so as they do that, they will have suddenly become able to see the rout of Gardiner's dragoons on the opposite end of the field. And the only explanation for what they do next, I think, is that they see that and assume something very calamitous has happened and they'd better get out of there too, because Hamilton's dragoons break under what seems to be very little actual pressure, and they follow Gardiner's dragoons out the field. So within a few minutes, General Cope has now lost most of his cavalry and his artillery. The key advantages that he has, other than the disciplined firepower of his infantry platoons. Now those men are now completely exposed out in that field against a larger force of Highlanders who are bearing down on them, ready for a hand-to-hand scrap, which is of course not what British infantry are out in the field to do. What's not clear, either from the accounts or from the archaeology yet, is how much physical resistance and contact is made between the charging clansmen and the bayonet line. But what is clear is that within moments, that resistance is overwhelmed and the British infantry are streaming westwards across the field. General Cope struggles, of course, to make any sense of what's going off. He is described as riding along the line, trying to exhort his men to behave like Britons. He sees the rout of the dragoons and rushes over to try and rally the dragoons and bring them back out into the field. They simply refuse to do so. There are descriptions of the Earl of Loudon and other senior officers brandishing pistols at the dragoons, threatening them and exhorting them to get back out onto the field, but they will not go back. And in fact, they are then subsequently led out of the battlefield through the enclosures onto the western side of Preston. Meantime, the infantry line fleeing, as I say, breaking up across the field, the Jacobites now mixing in amongst them and hacking away, and there are accounts of the field as a spectacle of horror, because these are bladed weapons that are doing much of the damage at this point now. And there are clearly knots of resistance. Famously, Colonel Gardiner himself, whose regiment had fled, refused to go. He tried to make a stand with a small number of infantry around a hawthorn tree on the battlefield, and was repeatedly wounded before finally being cut down and killed, just within sight of his house here on the battlefield. So there are lots of resistance, but the real problem is that the way that Preston village and the large estates around it, Preston House, ironically enough, perhaps the home of the brother of the Earl of Mar, who'd led the Jacobites 30 years before. The big walls around those gardens basically trap the armies in the field. The British infantry that flee from the battlefield run straight into those park walls, and they cannot get over them. They have to go around them, and those choke points out of the battlefield mean that essentially they can't do so. There's then a key moment, I think, where it's clear that the Jacobites have won the engagement, and the horses of the senior Jacobite officers, which had been left up in the churchyard we mentioned earlier, they are brought down onto the battlefield by the most direct route, which is over the wagon way, over the marshes, onto the battlefield. And that allows the Jacobite officers to mount up. All of the Jacobite officers, including Charles Edward himself, were on foot during the battle. And so by being able to mount up, they are then able to ride around the battlefield, as the Jacobite accounts tell us, instructing the men to start giving quarter and to basically, once it's clear that the British infantry cannot escape the battlefield and are no longer resisting, that Charles Edward, as I say, is trying to run a hearts and minds campaign here. He does not want to sully a battlefield victory with accusations of massacring his prisoners against the walls of Preston Estate. So I think the ability, and it's not clear who gave an order, if any order was given, but the movement of the Jacobite officers' horses onto the field so quickly, I think does save lives, because the British Army has lost 450 men during the engagement so far. Another 1,200 are then rounded up as prisoners. Now, there's all sorts of potential for that tally to have shifted if the Jacobite army wasn't brought under control very quickly. So General Cope, having seen that his dragoons will not come back out onto the battlefield, does what he says is the only thing he can do, which is to lead the only formed bodies of troops he still has, which are the dragoons, off the battlefield into safety. He leads them up a track which led directly to where Charles Edward's army had first deployed on the ridge the day before, and so we've gone in a big circle around the landscape. The track, incidentally, still known as Johnny Cope's Road today, and then from there he leads them off in an indirect route towards the border. So that is, in the space of that 15 or 20-minute fight, the total destruction of Cope's army, which is the only army in Scotland now other than the Jacobites. So it is, astonishingly, when it comes to it, one-sided in its outcome. It's not only the casualties that are inflicted and the large numbers of prisoners taken, of course, it's the fact that the entire baggage train and artillery train of the British Army are taken, including the military treasury, all the military correspondence and intelligence contained in the officers' baggage. And so this is, I think it's difficult to overstate the significance of the outcome of the battle in terms of changing the stakes involved in the campaign now. This is now unequivocally a very, very serious challenge to the government.
So you touched on a little bit the tactical consequences of this victory. Are there some big ones that will carry on into our next part of this series?
Well, I think what the Jacobites have discovered, which they had suspicions of before from the previous experiences at Sheriff Muir, for example, is that the Highland charge is a highly effective tactical option. It works at Prestonpans extraordinarily well, better than it worked at Killiecrankie, where the Jacobite charge takes heavy casualties on its way in. It works better than it worked along the full line at Sheriff Muir. So it shows itself to be extremely effective. It also shows and creates confidence in the Jacobite army now that they can face down a professional force. The Jacobites were less concerned with the nuances of whether the dragoons were poorly trained and whether they were poorly motivated or whatever the issues might be. From their perspective, they've met the test. They've stood toe-to-toe with a professional army and beaten it very, very soundly. And that's crucial. They've also shown their ability or the potential importance of being able to regain control of themselves after that charge has been launched. So what Charles Edward now has to do is work out a way, if it's possible, of harnessing all of that aggressive, assertive power of the charge and make it meaningful in future engagements where they may not have a perfect numerical parity. I think the key things are that the sort of traditional assumption that Highlanders were intimidated by horsemen and artillery have been dispelled. Those psychologically are very important, and so there's takeaways there. There's a tradition that says, well, now Prince Charlie has won this victory. He's now convinced that nothing will stand against him. He's convinced that the enemy didn't stand and resist very hard because no one will stand against their lawful prince. All of that is reading way too much into it. Charles Edward was a little bit more conservative about the risks of battle. He knew that it was always a chancy business. And during the Council of War before Prestonpans, he had sat the chiefs down and said, are we sure that we can pull this off? So he wasn't naive. But he does now have a confidence that that he can trust in the men to deliver, and that's important. But I think more than all of that is what I alluded to about the material of the war. Charles Edward now is able to say, I've met the test, I've captured the capital, I outmaneuvered my enemies in the run-up to that, I've faced them squarely in front of them with an open field and won. Not only that, I then displayed clemency in the way that the enemy was treated, and I haven't attempted to exploit that in any uncharitable way. I'm showing myself fit to lead, I'm showing myself fit to govern, and we can take this all of the way. And if you now therefore are convinced by all of that and want to come and join, we have the weapons to give to you and the equipment to give to you. We have the money to start paying for the expansion of the army. We have an artillery train. All of those things that now he's able to say, this is a serious endeavour. Everything up to this point was not good luck. It was good leadership. That's the message they can now send. The challenge for the rest of the war is to prove that this wasn't a fluke, and they've got to be able to replicate the experiment.
Just to add to that last point, I suppose it's also thinking of the American parallels, Lee, that you drew in the first of these episodes. This is a Saratoga moment, if you like. This is we are a viable force with a chance of winning, and yes, all those domestic concerns that Arran's outlined, but this is now a point where the Jacobites can actively appeal for foreign aid, and we're a viable cause. We're worth backing. We can really achieve something here. Just give us a bit of extra assistance, and that does indeed begin to materialise in the aftermath of the battle, which I'm sure we'll pick up on the consequences of in future episodes.
Yeah, I think I've got here in one of the cases next to me some gazettes from Paris that carry the news of the battle over to France, and they're illuminating. They're obviously filled with the exciting news, and they report the death of Gardner and Prince Charlie's great victory. But they conclude by saying, and now, inevitably, George II will start withdrawing troops from Europe. So it's very obvious what the French position on the impact of the battle is and what their interest is in it. But of course, it manifests itself within weeks when the French start opening correspondence with Charles Edward at Holyrood. So those ramifications are big and they're meaningful, and crucially, there is nobody now to interfere with Jacobite operations in Scotland for the next few weeks, and that sort of breathing space is crucial to the prince's ambitions.
I suppose then, as we move into the members in the camp to wrap things up, I mean, Arran, I met you through Jacobite reenactment. It's something you and I have done for a long time, but it's perhaps not going to be as familiar to a North American audience. I know Alex reenacts a Prussian in North America, so there may well be Jacobite reenactors over there. But I think in the same way that I've been educated on the American War of Independence scene, perhaps for our transatlantic listeners, you could just wrap up by saying a little bit about the reenactment scene over here, and particularly the commemorations at the battlefield.
Yes, I mean, a Jacobite reenactment is not done on a big scale, but it is, is an important part of the cultural landscape here. As you know, Andrew, for a long time, the biggest annual reenactment of the Jacobite conflict was in England and focused on a stage of the campaign that we'll talk about later. But in Scotland, this is a contested landscape. There are still very strong feelings about the Rising. Still a lot of people who identify with the events of the Rising, and that works in all sorts of curious and convoluted ways. People who, on the surface, might be the natural sympathetic Jacobites are furiously hostile to Charles Edward because they see him as the architect of the ultimate failure. And all its ramifications. And it gets bound up into contemporary politics in terms of nationalism, movements for Scottish independence, sometimes even into sectarianism as well, because the conflict, because of Charles Edward's faith, is still seen erroneously through Catholic Protestant lens as well. So all of these things mean that it is a contested landscape to a degree here, and that means that the space in which reenactment can occupy can be one that certainly from my perspective, I try to control. Sounds more controlling than it should, but sort of making sure that the message of what you're trying to do in terms of commemoration and education does not get consumed into debates about contemporary politics. So I think that's one of the reasons why it isn't bigger as a reenactment field. It has a much more commemorative sort of side to it, really, inside Scotland itself. Which you can see, for example, at Culloden annually, where there'll be hundreds and hundreds of people turn up to the commemorations in various degrees of Jacobite costume or uniform. But none of those are reenactors. So one of the things that I've tried to evolve over more recent years is to have a space for reenactment that is more apolitical. And Prestonpans is where we've opted to do that, because we're here at this part of the story where, as it's a cliche I've often repeated, but we read this story so often from the end. We know the Jacobites ultimately lose the war. Sorry if that's a spoiler for anybody, but it means that it's a slightly safer space to look at the beginning of the war from a reenactment perspective. So we've done lots of reenactments here at Prestonpans. As a means of being able to give something into the reenactment scene that had been missing, really. And it's unfortunate in a sense. I know for people like yourself, Andrew, that reenacted the Irish pickets, is that you weren't here in time for Prestonpans. So we have to show Redcoats versus Highlanders. Whereas, wouldn't it be fabulous if we did events where we could also show those French units and Jacobite cavalry units and Jacobite artillery units that all give a much bigger picture of what the Jacobite army really looked like for much of the war. But nevertheless, at least here we try to do a reenactment of Prestonpans every 3 years, and that has become, I think it's fair to say, the biggest Jacobite reenactment event in Britain. And like all reenactment, it's done for the love of it by the people that are prepared to put the work in.
Yes, I mean, coming to Scotland to do places like the Highland Folk Museum, which still goes down in my personal history, is probably my all-time favourite event. That was an amazing weekend when we came up as the Irish Pickets for that one as Dillons. But turning up in Scotland in a red coat, even with a white cockade in my hat, and there are some interesting conversations with the punters until you explain who you are. I think the people reenacting King George's red coats at times must get a bit more negativity, perhaps, to deal with. But I mean, having said that, never encountered it at Prestonpans. So maybe, as you say, that's the safe ground that we can all come to.
Well, yes, I do remember a friendly fire incident at Swarkston Bridge once, Andrew, where I had to stop the Klansmen from overrunning Dillons because you were in red. But yeah, that's those are the nuances of the story that so often get boiled out when this is presented as an England versus Scotland, or a Catholic versus Protestant, or a Highland versus English redcoat scenario. hopefully what we can do through conversations like this is show a bit of that depth and nuance, and keep plugging that message. It's certainly what we spend a lot of time here doing. I mean, here in Prestonpans, of course, the highest ranking casualty at the battle is Colonel Gardner, who lived in Prestonpans. So the highest ranking casualty in the British Army is a Scotsman. And without being too coarse about it, that's very convenient because it allows us to shine a light on the complexities of the pictures of who was fighting who and for what.
Thank you very much, Arran. This has been an awesome episode. Like we've said before, this is not our last episode in this series. We will definitely be having you on again very soon to talk about the next stages of this campaign and this history, which is really great. So thank you very much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed us as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with the link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date with the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gacino, music by Brianna Tam, Ardi Son, and Adrian Beringer. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.